Thank you very much, Keith, for that kind introduction. Here is the two books that I'm going to be speaking from. They're both by Ruth Haley Barton, and I would totally recommend you reading them because you're going to get a whole lot more out of that than anything that I will do. In fact, a lot of what I do today, I think, will stimulate more questions for you. And just as we start, I just want to offer my email address, which I will put on the chat. If anybody wants to ask me any questions or anybody wants to ask Keith any questions about this, because it's a huge topic and it's fundamentally changed my spiritual journey over the last 5 years. That's the impact that it's had on me. And I was hugely passionate when I came to St. John's. It was the first book that I talked to Keith about as well. And we've gone on a real journey together as a leadership team around what it really looks like to corporately discern together. And it's been an incredibly challenging journey as well, and difficult journey. And I'm all too aware that my context is not your context. We have a church of about 250, and we have a fairly sizable staff team as well compared to some of your churches as well. So I understand the context is different. So some of my examples are going to be based on my context, and you'll need to interpret them for your context. But the principles are the same, and I believe passionately to the core of who I am that this is a key and fundamental issue for our church in Scotland in this season that we find ourselves in. I believe strongly that this should be an ongoing discussion within the network, and I don't really think there is a more pressing need in the church in Scotland at this time than to really hear what God is saying to his church in our local context and also for our nation. I'm passionate about this because I believe church leadership matters, and it matters more now than ever, especially in the situation that we currently find ourselves in. Here's a quote from Paul Anderson. It's in the book, but I just wanted to start with this. Our great need of the church today is to experience the dynamic leadership of Christ as its head. The scriptures promise us that Christ's Spirit will be with us, will guide us, and will lead us into all truth. This is the most striking implication of one's belief in the resurrected Lord. If Christ is alive, he desires to lead his church. If Christ desires to lead his church, his will should be sought. If his will can be sought, then it can be discerned. And if it can be discerned, it deserves to be obeyed. This is nothing more than the basic Christian life. This is nothing more than the basic Christian life. You see, I have found myself under two types of leadership in the churches that I've found myself in. Growing up as a pastor's kid in a small church in Bodwell, through being a member of a large church of 1,000 people in Wisconsin in the States, and being involved in leadership at Central in Edinburgh. Even although these churches are incredibly varied in size and context, all have struggled to discern God's will and build a culture of hearing from God corporately as leadership teams and indeed as a church family. I would argue it's mainly because the church's organisational structures have not been set up to facilitate discernment. The churches that I have been involved in have fallen into two broad main categories. Category one, and you may find yourselves in one or another of these categories, or maybe somewhere in between. One is the will of the people model, where leadership see their role primarily as representatives of the church family. Now, they might not say that out loud, but that's really how the church functions. In this model, most matters need to be discerned by the whole church family, and this leads to real stagnation within the church. The second model that I've been part of is senior pastor as CEO, where unless there is a catastrophic failure or obvious sin, then it's the senior pastor that basically determines what God's will is and the direction of travel of the church. And in my experience, again, this never ends well, as eventually control is relinquished and removed, even after potentially a long period of time, off that leader. Here's another quote from Danny Morris and Charles Olson. Egocentricity and self-control are fundamental dynamics of the human condition. We know we are supposed to surrender to God's will, and we may genuinely want to, but most of us continue to face the almost irresistible tendency to assert our own will. We overhear Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours be done, but have trouble making it our own. So we can all assent to the concept that we want to pursue God's will, but how do we actually do this in the context that we find ourselves in? Well, I'm offering 4 points, and like I said, I will share my notes with whoever wants them. Point number 1, reaffirm a commitment that God's will can be discerned in your context and in your situation. Indeed, you will make a commitment to make it your life's work to help teams of leaders discern and obey God's will. Number 2, and it's a big point that Ruth makes, and it's actually a third of the book. Learn how to do it in your own life. It starts with you. It starts with leadership learning how to discern for their own situations. Because if they don't know how to do it for their own situations, how on earth are they going to do it in a corporate context? My third point, and it's pretty much the one that I would want you to take away with you if you were to forget everything else. The question is, what are the issues that need discerned? And a sub-question, what is your process for discerning what needs to be discerned? That is the fundamental question, and that has been the journey that we've been on. You see, to do this properly and to really hear from God, you can only look at 3 or 4 issues for corporate discernment. And that's fundamentally the problem with what I see with a lot of churches, is we try and discern 50 or 60 or 70 things, and it never works because you don't have capacity to do that. So what are the key things the Holy Spirit is asking you to hear from him on at the moment? And fourthly, how are you going to facilitate this good discernment? How are you going to make this happen? Again, Ruth talks about this in her book, but things like weekends away, meetings with 1-point agendas, and a serious look at delegation of work to other teams and other groups. The reality is that most issues don't need to be discerned. And this has been the most difficult for us as a leadership team to work our way through. We recognise that our leadership was involved in lots of decisions that weren't of a fundamental nature to the vision of the church. See, leaders like to get involved in making decisions, but they don't have capacity to get involved in all of them. We didn't have a process to really hear from God on the really important things because we didn't have the time and capacity to do it. In fact, we've gone on a journey as a church to completely restructure how leadership works. And we've created 3 teams within our church: a team of elders, a team of trustees, and a staff management team. So we basically ripped up the template and started again because we were so committed to this concept. So what decisions did we decide that needed to be discerned, or what decisions should be discerned? Well, like I said at the beginning, that's up to you to decide. But a key filter for us was, what can only we do as leaders, as elders in our context? What is the work that only we can do? And we had a fundamental commitment to delegate everything else. And that could be delegated to individual leaders on the team, or it could be delegated to the staff. But the mindset was, we are going to keep in our leadership context the things that only we can do, and the rest is going to get delegated. So what was that in our context? When our context, that was vision. So for us, that's around church planting. It's around the charity that we set up to look at needs in our community. It's around training and developing leaders. That stayed with our team. Our values in this season: pursuing God's will, culture of honor, everybody gets to play. That was something that our leaders held on to and want to live and embody, and create space to be able to talk about how we implement this into the culture of our church family. Our teaching plan for 18 months to 5 years, that stayed with the leadership team, so that we could navigate through theological issues together as it relates to sexuality, gender, race, ecology, the issues of our day that we find ourselves in. Who does God want to be on an elder or leadership team or elder team? And how are we going to fund the vision? These are basically the fundamental issues that we discerned. So what's not on that list? Well, what's not on that list for us is staffing plan, services, events, budget. A lot of things that I suggest are maybe on your leadership's agenda at the moment. Is there ways and means that you can get things done in a different way so that you're able to bring the fundamental things to God? And just finally, part of it for us was learning a new language, learning a new way to talk to each other, learning new words that was straight out of Ruth's book, but were very foreign to us when we started using them, but have been incredibly helpful as we've gone on this journey. The first one is consolation. And what we mean by that is we're looking for a sense of God's presence in our decision making. In the things that really, really matter, we will not move forward unless the leadership team is in complete agreement. If one person in our team is unhappy, then we won't move forward in these fundamental issues. And that's been such a double think for me personally, because what this process has actually brought forward is that there's stuff within my remit that I now action on without reference to the leadership team, because it's been fully delegated to me and Keith. But conversely, there's stuff that I will not move on, because that's for the elders to discern together. So this sense of consolation. So when we have looked at 1 point agendas, or we've gone away for a day and we've looked at one key point together, we have used this language of consolation. I feel consoled about that. I feel God's presence in this decision, or I don't. And the opposite of that is desolation as well. So we've used language of desolation in terms of when we're talking to each other. And the final word, I mean, there's lots more, but the final word that I wanted to bring up today was the concept of indifference. And what that means is that you can hold values really strongly as an individual, but when you come to this corporate decision-making process, you lay down your own agenda and you join the team, and that you will be as indifferent as you possibly can be to the decision that is made. And that when the decision is made, you will speak as one team together. I have a quote just to finish. Cultivating the habit of discernment means we are always seeking the movement of God's Spirit so we can abandon ourselves to it. Sometimes abandoning ourselves to the will of God is like floating down a river. We relax and allow the current of the river to carry us along. At other times, it is more like trying to run the rapids or ride a large wave. We must keep our body and mind attuned to the dynamic of the water so we can ride it to its destination rather than being toppled by its force. Either way, we do not get to set the direction or the speed of the current. Rather, we seek the best way to let the current carry us in the direction God has for us.